Last year, my debit card got declined while I was trying to buy groceries with $11 left in my account. My parents told me I was irresponsible, dramatic, and bad with money for years. What I didn't know was they were secretly stealing my $3.4 million trust fund to pay for my sister's luxury apartment, vacations, and designer lifestyle. Then, at exactly 8:14 on a rainy Thursday morning, federal investigators froze their accounts after my grandfather uncovered 29 years of fraud hidden behind fake family loyalty. By the end of it, my father was facing criminal financial charges, my mother was begging me not to let them lose the house, and the people who spent my whole life making me feel worthless finally had to hear the truth out loud. My name is Ilara Whitmore, and this is the revenge story my family never thought I would survive long enough to tell. Chapter 1. The Birthday Toast That Destroyed My Family. My grandfather asked what I did with the $3.4 million he left me, and my mother dropped her fork so hard it cracked the side of her plate. That was the moment I realized something was deeply wrong with my family. Rain hammered against the windows of my parents' house outside Pittsburgh while everybody at the dinner table sat frozen. My sister Celeste looked confused. My father looked like someone had punched him in the chest. My mother recovered first, of course. She always did. "Dad, enough," Genevieve said too quickly. "You are upsetting her." Upsetting me. Not confused, not shocked, not asking what trust fund he was talking about. Upsetting me. Arthur Bennett did not take his eyes off me. He stood there beside the dining table with one hand resting on the back of his chair while the storm rattled the windows behind him. "Ilara, sweetheart," he said carefully, "what did you do with the trust your grandmother left you?" I honestly thought I had misheard him. I remember laughing a little because that was what I did when things got uncomfortable. I laughed. I apologized. I made myself smaller so everyone else could stay comfortable. "Grandpa," I said, "I think you have me confused with somebody else." Then he placed a thick black binder on the table. Nobody spoke. That silence scared me more than the question. An hour earlier, I had been sitting in my Corolla in my parents' driveway, checking my bank account before going inside. $43. That was all I had until payday. I remember staring at the number while the heat barely worked in my car and rainwater dripped through the tiny crack near the passenger side window I still could not afford to fix. Then I grabbed the grocery store cupcakes I bought on clearance after work and forced myself out into the rain. The second I walked through the front door, I felt what I always felt there, like I was interrupting somebody else's life. Celeste was in the dining room talking about a gallery owner in Brooklyn who wanted to feature her illustrations in a spring showcase. My mother was hanging on every word, like Celeste was already famous. Richard barely looked up from his phone when I walked in, soaked from the storm. "Nice of you to join us," he muttered. "Sorry I'm late," I said automatically. I had spent my whole life apologizing for taking up space in that house. Genevieve glanced down on my shoes first, wet black flats from Walmart with the edges peeling slightly near the heel. "You really need to buy better shoes, honey." Not hello, not happy birthday, just quiet disappointment. Celeste finally noticed me standing there. "Oh my God, Ilara, you're drenched." "I'm okay." Arthur crossed the room slowly and hugged me longer than anybody else ever did. "You look tired, sweetheart," he whispered. "Work's been busy." Genevieve laughed softly while adjusting her bracelet on her wrist. "She works too much because she doesn't know how to relax. Your sister creates stress for herself." I smiled because that was easier than explaining exhaustion to people who only respected struggle when it belonged to somebody else. Dinner felt like every family dinner I had survived growing up. Celeste talked, my parents admired her, I filled empty glasses and carried dishes to the kitchen before anyone asked. At one point, Celeste mentioned needing a bigger studio space in Brooklyn. "Creative people need room to grow," Richard said. My mother nodded immediately. "Exactly." I remember looking down at my plate because earlier that morning, my debit card had declined at a gas station before finally going through on the second try. Nobody at that table knew that. Or maybe they did. That thought makes me sick now. Celeste turned toward me halfway through dinner. "Wait, when's the last time you took a vacation?" I tried to remember. I honestly couldn't. 5 years, maybe? Her eyes widened. Seriously? Genevieve cut in before I could answer. Ilara doesn't know how to stop worrying long enough to enjoy herself. Arthur stopped eating. It was subtle, but I noticed him watching my parents every time money came up. Every single time. Richard made another joke about my car. "You know, one day that thing's just going to die in the middle of the highway." Everybody laughed, except Arthur. The crazy thing is, it already had. 3 months ago, my Corolla broke down on the Pennsylvania Turnpike during freezing rain after a late shift. I called my mother because I didn't know who else to call. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she snapped. "Mom, I'm stuck out here and I don't know what to do." That's what happens when you buy junk cars. Then she hung up. Arthur drove 40 minutes through a storm to get me. I never forgot that. Back at the dinner table, I caught him staring at me again. Not with pity, with confusion, like he was trying to solve something. Then came the toast. Arthur slowly stood up and raised his glass. "To my granddaughter Ilara, Evelyn would have been proud of the woman you became." My chest tightened at the mention of my grandmother. She was the only person in that family who ever made me feel seen. Arthur looked directly at me. Then he asked what happened to the money. The room died. Genevieve dropped her fork. Richard turned pale. Celeste looked back and forth between them. I stared at Arthur. "What money?" He slid the black binder toward me. "Your trust fund." Genevieve stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the hardwood. "Dad, this is not the time." "Then when is the time?" asked Arthur quietly. Nobody answered. That was the worst part. Nobody said he was lying. The rest of dinner collapsed after that. My mother kept insisting Arthur was old and confused. Richard said nobody needed unnecessary drama. Celeste kept asking questions nobody answered. I barely remember driving home. I just remembered the storm, and the feeling growing in my stomach, like pieces of my life were rearranging themselves right in front of me. Memories started surfacing one after another. Celeste getting piano lessons, Celeste getting art camp, Celeste getting a MacBook before college, me being called mature because I never asked for anything, me being told I was practical, me learning very young that nobody likes a difficult daughter. Every time I cried growing up, my mother used the same words: too sensitive, too emotional, too negative. Eventually, I believed her. By the time I parked outside my apartment building, my phone was vibrating non-stop in the cup holder. Genevieve, Richard, Celeste. A new text from my mother lit up the screen. "Do not let your grandfather divide this family." Another from Richard. "Call me immediately." Then Celeste. "Ilara, what is happening?" I stared at the messages for a long time while rain hit the roof of my car. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my parents had been lying to me for a lot longer than one night. Then I turned my phone off and sat alone in the dark. Chapter 2: The Years They Watched Me Drown. I barely slept after my grandfather called. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother dropping that fork. Not shocked, terrified. By 6 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and walked into my kitchen. The radiator rattled against the wall while cold air slipped through the old apartment windows. I opened the fridge and stared at half a loaf of bread, expired yogurt, and a bottle of mustard. Payday was still 3 days away. I checked my bank account while the coffee brewed. $31. I laughed quietly because crying would have felt too dramatic, and my family had spent years teaching me that dramatic women were exhausting. Before leaving for work, I wrapped my phone charger around my hand carefully so the frayed part near the base would not split open again. I had been meaning to replace it for months. I just never had extra money. That was my life back then. Not tragic enough for sympathy, just constantly running out. I worked at Mercer Freight Solutions in Pittsburgh as an administrative coordinator. During the day, I fixed shipping problems and answered angry client emails. At night, I did freelance data entry for a medical billing company. On weekends, I tutored high school students online. I was tired all the time, not sleepy, hollow. By the time I got to work, Melissa Grant was already pouring coffee in the break room. Jesus, Alara, you look awful. Good morning to you, too. I mean it. Are you sick? I almost told her everything about the trust fund, about my parents, about the feeling that my entire life suddenly looked fake. Instead, I shrugged. Just tired. Melissa looked at me carefully. You know, living like this isn't normal, right? I smiled weakly and walked back to my desk before she could ask more questions. That afternoon, I stopped at a grocery store near the office with $12 cash in my wallet. I stood in the produce aisle doing math in my head. Bananas or gas? Chicken or laundry detergent? At one point, I picked up strawberries, stared at them for a few seconds, then put them back because $6 suddenly felt irresponsible. At checkout, my debit card declined the first time. The cashier avoided eye contact while I transferred $20 from savings into checking. My savings account had $20 in it. I carried the grocery bags back to my Corolla and sat there staring through the windshield while people pushed carts through the parking lot around me. I felt exhausted in a way sleep could not fix, like I had been drowning quietly for years and everybody around me got so used to it that they started calling it maturity. Then my phone buzzed. Celeste had posted pictures from a rooftop wine bar in Brooklyn. New studio celebration. She stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan while her friends held expensive cocktails toward the camera. My mother commented almost immediately. So proud of my talented girl. I looked down at the generic grocery bags sitting in my passenger seat and suddenly felt embarrassed by my entire life. That night, I ate peanut butter toast over my sink while finishing freelance spreadsheets because I was too tired to wash dishes. 3 weeks later, my roommate disappeared. I came home after work and found half the apartment empty. Her bedroom door stood open with nothing inside except dust marks where furniture used to sit. No warning, no note, nothing. Then I opened the email from the leasing office. Rent due in 48 hours. Balance owed, $1,280. I sat down hard on the floor because my knees stopped working. For almost an hour I tried figuring out who I could borrow money from before finally calling my father. He answered sounding irritated already. What now? Dad, I really need help. Silence. My roommate left and I can't cover rent this month. I just need a little time. I can pay you back after my next paycheck. He heard him sigh heavily. Alara, when are you going to get your life together? My face burned instantly. I'm trying. No, you're surviving one disaster at a time. Those are different things. I swallowed hard. Please, I just need help once. Family is not a bank, he snapped. Then his voice softened in that fake, calm way people use when they want to sound reasonable while hurting you. You're almost 30 years old. Grow up. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time afterward, not angry, ashamed. That was the worst part. Even after being rejected, I still felt guilty for asking. The next few days were humiliating in small, quiet ways. I sold my television online to a college kid. I pawned the gold necklace my grandmother Evelyn gave me before she died. I skipped meals. Melissa quietly approved in advance on my paycheck. When I tried thanking her, she squeezed my shoulder gently. Everybody needs help sometimes, honey. I almost cried in her office because strangers had always treated me softer than my own family.
2 days after I barely managed to pay rent, my mother called while I sat in my car outside work. "Guess what? Your sister found the cutest studio in Brooklyn." I closed my eyes. "That's nice." "Your father and I are helping with the deposit. Creative careers need investment." I looked at the glowing check engine light on my dashboard. That was when I realized something I had never allowed myself to think before. My parents always sounded proud when they talked about Celeste. They only sounded tired when they talked about me. Thanksgiving felt exactly the same as every holiday before it. I arrived carrying grocery store rolls and a discounted pie because it was all I could afford. Celeste talked excitedly about expanding her studio again. Richard smiled proudly. Creative people need room to grow. Genevieve looked at me across the table. "Maybe if you stopped overworking yourself all the time, you wouldn't always look exhausted." Celeste frowned slightly. "Why are you always so tired lately?" Before I could answer, Genevieve jumped in smoothly. "Because your sister makes life harder than it needs to be. She doesn't know how to relax." Everybody moved on, but something inside me didn't. For the first time in my life, I started wondering if maybe I was not the problem after all. A few months later, my Corolla broke down during freezing rain on the Pennsylvania Turnpike after a late shift. Smoke poured from under the hood, while trucks screamed past me through the dark. I called my mother, crying so hard I could barely breathe. "Mom, my car died." "That's what happens when you buy garbage cars," she snapped. Then she hung up. 40 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me through the storm. "Arthur." During the drive home, he glanced toward me several times while I tried to stop shivering. Finally, he asked quietly how much money I had in savings. I laughed before I could stop myself. "I think I have $20 right now." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Your grandmother made sure you were supposed to be taken care of," he said softly. The next morning after my birthday dinner, my phone rang at exactly 8:15. "Arthur." His voice sounded heavy. "Come meet me downtown, sweetheart." "Why?" "Because you deserve to know what they did to you."
Chapter 3. The Audit with My Name on It. The elevator ride to Arthur's office felt like being carried towards something irreversible. I stood in the back corner watching the floor numbers climb while my stomach twisted harder with every second. Part of me still believed there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe my grandfather mixed up paperwork. Maybe the trust still existed untouched somewhere. Maybe my parents delayed transferring it because of taxes. I kept building excuses because the alternative felt impossible. By the time the elevator doors opened on the 20th floor, my hands were shaking sharply. Arthur's office overlooked downtown Pittsburgh through massive rain-streaked windows. Everything inside felt cold and expensive, in a quiet, old-money kind of way. Dark shelves lined the walls beside framed photographs from charity dinners and business events stretching back decades. Martin Hale was already sitting at the conference table. 3 black binders rested neatly in front of him. Arthur stood near the windows with his back turned towards us. That scared me immediately. My grandfather had always been the kind of man who looked directly at people, even during uncomfortable conversations. Now he could not even face me. "Sweetheart, sit down." His voice sounded older than normal. I lowered myself carefully into one of the leather chairs while my pulse hammered against my throat. Nobody touched the binders. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched long enough that I started hearing the hum of the air conditioning above us. Finally, Martin folded his hands together. "What you're about to hear is going to be very difficult, Miss Whitmore." Even then, some hopeful, pathetic part of me still believed this conversation would end with confusion and apologies. Arthur finally turned around. His eyes already looked wet. "I failed you, Alara.
The words hit harder than I expected. I shook my head immediately. "No, you don't even know what happened yet." "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." That was the moment real fear settled into my chest. Martin opened the first binder slowly. The Alara Whitmore Trust Audit, 1996 through 2025. Seeing my full name printed across the front made everything suddenly feel real. Martin adjusted his glasses carefully. "Your grandmother Evelyn Bennett established a protected trust in your name shortly after your birth." He slid several papers towards me. The original estimated value was approximately $3.4 million in investments and protected assets. $3.4 million. The number felt unreal next to memories of overdraft fees and grocery store math. "You were legally supposed to gain control of the trust when you turned 18 in 2014. Supposed to. That word stuck inside my head. Richard and Genevieve Whitmore were appointed trustees until the transfer date." I nodded slowly. "Okay." Martin glanced down briefly before continuing. "The transfer never occurred." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard him. "What do you mean it never occurred?" Arthur lowered his eyes. Martin slid another stack of documents towards me. "There is no legal record showing the trust was ever transferred into your control." I stared down at the paperwork without understanding any of it. Maybe they were still managing it for me. Nobody answered. That silence terrified me more than words would have. Martin opened the second binder. "Over the last 11 years, substantial withdrawals were made from the trust for unauthorized personal expenditures." Then he turned the first page towards me. "Kitchen renovation, $62,000. Immediately I remembered my mother standing proudly inside that remodeled kitchen, telling neighbors she and Richard sacrificed for years to afford it. I believed her. Another page turned. Brooklyn apartment lease payments. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might throw up. Dozens of wire transfers, thousands of dollars. Suddenly I was back inside my Corolla crying because I could not make rent, while my parents quietly paid luxury Brooklyn prices for Celeste. The room stayed painfully silent except for pages turning. Luxury wellness retreat, $8,000. Another memory slammed into me instantly. Freezing rain, Pennsylvania Turnpike, smoke pouring from my hood. My mother hanging up while I begged for help. Nausea climbed into my throat so fast I pressed my hand against my mouth. Martin kept going. Student tuition payments, travel expenses, private studio costs, jewelry purchases. Every page carried receipts, dates, wire transfers, authorization signatures, proof. That was the part destroying me. Not suspicion, proof. Cold, organized evidence that every struggle in my adult life happened while millions of dollars existed in my name. Money that should have protected me. Money that should have changed everything. Instead, my parents watched me drown and called it independence. I suddenly remembered my father lecturing me after my debit card declined during college. Money doesn't grow on trees, Alara. Then another memory surfaced. Richard laughing about my Corolla. Genevieve saying I stressed myself out too much. My mother explaining why Celeste needed more support because creative careers were unstable. Every lecture, every criticism, every moment they made me feel irresponsible, all while spending my money behind my back. My vision blurred suddenly. I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table and realized my entire life had quietly been rearranged in front of me. Birthdays, Christmases, family dinners, arguments. None of them looked the same anymore. I heard my own voice shaking before I realized I was speaking. I was never struggling by accident. Nobody moved. Arthur covered his face with one hand. When he finally looked back up, tears sat openly in his eyes. I started suspecting years ago, he admitted quietly, but I kept telling myself my own daughter could never do this to her child. The guilt in his voice somehow hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. Then another thought hit me hard enough to stop everything else. Celeste, did she know? I suddenly remembered moments that felt strange now. Her offering to buy groceries once. The uncomfortable look on her face during holiday dinners whenever money came up. The way she sometimes asked if I was okay before my mother interrupted. Had she suspected something? Or had my parents manipulated her too? I honestly did not know which answer would hurt more. Martin finally closed the binder carefully. At this point, you have legal options available to you. I barely heard him. Part of me wanted to stand up and leave, pretend none of this existed, keep protecting my family the way I always had. Because exposing them felt monstrous. Then my mind dragged me backward again. $31 in my bank account, the pawn shop, the grocery store checkout, the empty fridge, the freezing highway. The humiliation of begging my father for help while he lectured me about responsibility. Something inside me finally shifted, not sadness, rage. I suddenly realized my parents had not only stolen money from me, they had stolen my ability to trust my own reality. Martin spoke carefully. You can walk away quietly if you choose, or you can confront them directly. I stared at the binders spread across the conference table, years of lies sitting neatly in black leather folders. Then I looked at Arthur. For the first time in my life, I choose myself.
Chapter 4. Every lie had a receipt. Hayne hammered against the conference room windows while everybody avoided looking at each other. Downtown Pittsburgh disappeared behind gray clouds and water streaks, making the entire room feel sealed off from the rest of the world. The long mahogany table sat between us like a courtroom barrier. Black audit binders, bank statements, transfer records, legal paperwork, years of lies stacked neatly in front of everybody. Genevieve arrived first. Perfect hair, perfect coat, perfect posture. But her hands shook when she pulled out her chair. Richard came behind her looking exhausted and pale, like he had not slept all night. Celeste followed slowly, confusion already spreading across her face the second she saw the paperwork. Nobody looked directly at me. That hurt more than anger would have. Martin Hale adjusted the documents in front of him carefully, while silence stretched across the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Genevieve finally forced a tight smile. "Arthur, this is ridiculous." Arthur did not even look at her. Martin opened the first binder. No dramatic speech, no emotional setup, just facts. The following audit reflects financial activity connected to the Alara Whitmore Trust between 1996 and 2025. Richard lowered his eyes immediately. Martin turned the first page. Kitchen renovation expenditures, $62,000. Receipt, transfer confirmation, signature. I watched my mother's face carefully while the paperwork slid across the table. For a second, I remembered her proudly showing neighbors the remodeled kitchen while talking about sacrifice and budgeting. I remembered believing every word. Another page turned. Brooklyn residential lease payments connected to Celeste Whitmore. Celeste frowned immediately. What does that mean? Martin slid several wire transfers toward her. I watched the color drain slowly from her face while she read the numbers. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be real."
Nobody answered her. The room stayed silent except for paper moving across the table. Luxury wellness retreat expenditures. Another receipt, another signature, another transfer. Genevieve finally snapped. "We are a family. That money supported this family." Arthur's voice cut through the room instantly. "Stop lying." Everybody froze. I had never heard my grandfather sound like that before. Cold, sharp, finished. Even Genevieve looked startled. Martin continued calmly. Travel expenditures, jewelry purchases, private studio expenses. Another page. Rolex purchase, $12,400. Richard covered his face with one hand. Celeste looked physically sick now. "I didn't know," she said suddenly. Tears filled her eyes. "I swear to God, Ilara, I didn't know." I stared at her for several seconds. Part of me believed her. Another part remembered every expensive apartment and every polished social media post while I was counting grocery money. Genevieve straightened immediately. "This is exactly what I warned everybody about. We are destroying this family over money." I almost laughed. Money, as if this had ever only been about money. Martin calmly turned another page. Brooklyn lease transfer, $4,200. That was more than 3 times my rent. Spa retreat expenditures, $8,000. A flash of freezing rain crossed my mind instantly. Smoke pouring from my Corolla, my mother hanging up while I cried beside the highway. Private tuition payments. Another memory. Me sitting alone on my dorm floor eating ramen noodles because I couldn't afford groceries until payday. Each receipt felt like another blade sliding slowly into my chest. Nobody could escape it anymore, not even me. Genevieve finally looked directly at me. "You were always stronger than your sister." The words hit me harder than the financial betrayal. Richard nodded weakly beside her. "Celeste needed more support. You always seemed independent." Independent. That word almost made me sick. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "You didn't just take money from me." My voice sounded terrifyingly calm. "You made me believe I wasn't worth helping." Nobody spoke after that. The silence stretched so long I could hear rain hitting the windows again. Celeste started crying openly. Richard wiped tears across his face with shaking hands. Genevieve looked trapped now. Her mascara had started smearing beneath one eye, but even then she still looked more frightened than remorseful. That was when I finally understood something about my mother. She loved appearances more than people. Martin carefully pushed several documents toward me. "These papers begin the process of restoring legal control of the trust." Richard finally looked up at me fully. For the first time in my life, he looked afraid of me. "Ilara, please." I waited quietly. His voice cracked. "What are we supposed to do now?" The question hung in the room for several seconds, and suddenly I remembered sitting on my apartment floor after he refused to help me pay rent. Family is not a bank. Grow up, figure it out yourself. I held his stare for a long moment. Then I answered softly, "I guess you'll have to figure it out." Richard broke completely after that. He lowered his face into his hands while Genevieve stared at me like she no longer recognized her own daughter. Maybe she never really had. Martin carefully pushed several documents toward me. My hand trembled slightly when I picked it up. Not from fear anymore, from exhaustion. Years of shame, years of survival, years of believing every struggle was my fault. I signed my name slowly across the bottom line. The click of the pen against the table sounded louder than anything else in the room. Then I stood up. Nobody stopped me, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't apologize for taking up space.
Chapter 5. The quietest peace I ever felt. The elevator doors closed behind me while Celeste cried quietly beside me. Not the controlled crying from the conference room. This sounded smaller somehow, more real. "I didn't know," she whispered again. "Alara, I swear I didn't know." I stared at the glowing floor numbers without answering right away. Part of me wanted to comfort her automatically. That reflex still lived somewhere deep inside me. Smooth things over, make everybody else feel okay first. But I was exhausted, not physically, emotionally. "I believe you," I finally said. She looked up immediately, like she had been holding her breath waiting for that answer. "Then please don't shut me out." The pain in her voice almost broke me anyway. But pain did not erase damage. "I need space," I said quietly. She wiped tears across her face. "I should have noticed." That sentence stayed with me long after the elevator doors opened, because she was right. She should have noticed. Then again, so should I. That was the ugliest thing about toxic families. Everybody adapted to the system eventually, even when the system was quietly destroying someone standing right in front of them. I walked out into the rain without looking back. The next few weeks felt unreal. Bank investigations started almost immediately after Martin filed the legal paperwork. Trust-linked accounts were frozen. The mortgage refinance entered formal review. Arthur warned me there was a real possibility my parents could lose the house, depending on what investigators uncovered. A month later, I drove past the neighborhood and saw a foreclosure notice taped beside the front door. I sat in my car staring at it for almost a full minute. No triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion. Genevieve started emailing me constantly after that. "You are destroying this family. Your father barely sleeps anymore. After everything we sacrificed for you." Not one real apology. Not once did she ask whether I was okay. Every message carried the same desperate manipulation wrapped in different words. At first, I still read them still. Then, eventually, I stopped opening them altogether. The final email arrived at midnight while I sat alone eating takeout noodles on my apartment floor. "Families forgive each other, Alara." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I blocked her email address, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty afterward. Richard collapsed faster than Genevieve did. Arthur told me he barely left the house anymore. Apparently, he spent entire afternoons sitting silently at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal paperwork while investigators and attorneys called nonstop. Genevieve still blamed everyone except herself. The banks, Arthur, Martin, me, anybody except the woman who signed the transfers. Arthur carried guilt differently. A few weeks later, he invited me to lunch downtown. He looked older than I had ever seen him before. "I should have realized something was wrong years ago," he admitted quietly. I shook my head immediately. "You trusted your daughter." "I trusted the wrong person." The sadness in his voice hurt in a way I did not expect. That was the thing about Arthur. He never tried pretending he was innocent. He understood he failed me too, even if he never meant to. That made forgiveness possible someday. Not immediate, but possible. 3 months later, I quit my job in Pittsburgh. Melissa hugged me tightly in the office parking lot while cold wind whipped through our coats. "You deserve a life that doesn't feel this heavy," she whispered. I almost cried right there beside her car. I sold the Corolla to a mechanic outside Scranton for $900 cash. Watching it disappear down the road felt strangely emotional. That car carried every version of me that fought to survive. The girl counting grocery money, the girl crying over rent, the girl stranded beside the highway believing nobody was coming to help her. I packed everything I owned into 4 suitcases and moved to Seattle. My apartment overlooked gray water near the marina. Small sailboats drifted quietly outside the windows every morning while fog rolled across the shoreline. The silence there felt unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious. The first night in Seattle, I woke up at 3 in the morning panicking because I thought I forgot to pay rent.
Then I remembered I could afford it now. I lay there staring at the ceiling while my heartbeat slowly calmed down. For the first time in years, survival was no longer my full-time job. Healing happened quietly after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. The first time I bought groceries without checking every price, I stood frozen in the cereal aisle trying not to cry. The first time I slept through an entire night without panic twisting through my chest, I woke up confused because my body did not understand rest anymore. I started cooking dinner while music played softly through the apartment instead of eating over the sink between freelance shifts. I bought flowers once just because I liked them. Tiny things started feeling enormous. Some scars stayed anyway. I still apologized too quickly, still flinched whenever my phone rang unexpectedly, still caught myself trying to make my emotions smaller so other people could stay comfortable. Trauma does not disappear just because your circumstances improve. But little by little, I stopped feeling like a burden inside every room I entered. Arthur visited Seattle 6 months later. We drank coffee near the marina, while gray clouds drifted over the water. Later, he stood quietly inside my apartment looking around at the bookshelf beside the window, the plants near the kitchen counter, the soft yellow lamp glowing beside the couch. Peace. That was what he was looking at. "Evelyn would have been proud of you," he said softly. I stared out toward the water for a long moment before answering. I spent most of my life believing something was wrong with me. Arthur's expression tightened painfully. "There was never anything wrong with you, sweetheart." And for the first time, I actually believed someone when they said that to me. After he left, I stood alone beside the apartment window watching early morning light spread slowly across the water. My phone sat face down on the counter behind me, silent. No missed calls, no panic, no guilt crawling through my chest, just quiet. And standing there in that silence, I finally understood something that changed everything. The worst thing my parents stole from me was never the money. It was the belief that my feelings mattered. They taught me to shrink myself so other people could stay comfortable, to apologize for existing, to confuse silence with love. But peace does not begin when other people finally understand your pain. It begins the moment you stop begging them to. And maybe some of you listening understand exactly what that feels like. If you have spent your whole life making yourself smaller just to be loved, I hope you remember this. Your life changes the moment you stop apologizing for your own existence.